Well, welcome. Thank you for tuning in. In the spirit of the recent uprisings across the nation and the world in response to police murders of Black and Brown people, the Wendland-Cook Program and Religion and Justice is holding a series of 3 conversations on race and class with prominent academics, activists, and public figures. Our first guest today is Vincent Lloyd, who I'm really excited to have a conversation with. And I want to really just jump right in around the basic analysis that the Wendland-Cook has been fostering here in regard to our current crises of economic crises, public health crises, political crises, racial crises, how it is that we're all thinking about these together, these issues together. And that's generally thought about in terms of upholding an intersectional lens and thinking about our current economic structures as Cedric Robinson has termed it, racial capitalism, right? So that's where I'd really like to start. As we begin to think about what the massive social movements mean for us today as activists and academics, I'd like to ask you about the role of intersectional thinking within your own work, and how it's important and necessary even to think race and class together, to think of them as in the terms of racial capitalism. So perhaps we can begin there and hear some of your thoughts on those issues.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me and for staging these conversations about really important issues at a really important moment. Yeah, so maybe I'll approach the question in a few ways. It's a big set of questions that you're asking. One has to do with what is so heartening about our moment. And in addition to seeing the many people in the streets, the change in the conversation that's happening, I think the shift in the way that particularly young Black activists are articulating their politics is really important to note. That shift involves centering intersectionality, not only around gender and disability and class, but also questions of immigration, questions of what the complications of Blackness, and when those young Black organizers are critiquing respectability politics, which they identify with which they rightly identify with those figures of an earlier protest generation that achieved media visibility and enjoyed that media visibility. That critique of respectability is also a critique of the absence of class analysis, right? That respectability politics is politics that suggests if Black folks embody a middle class ideal or perform a middle class ideal, then will be accepted by the nation or by white powers that be. And it's heartening to hear and see that people are calling that out, saying that that's never worked. And doing that perverts Black politics. It disorients Black politics. We need to think race and class together, thinking about racial capitalism as one lens that's useful in doing that. And in thinking race and class together, it means we have to be privileging not only the voices of Black folks, but of poor and working class Black folks. That as soon as Black folks start achieving a certain level of wealth and middle class status, their political orientation gets worse and worse, more and more confused. So the most clarity one finds is among those poor and working class Black folks. Of course, in a fallen world, that's not perfect clarity, but that's a place that one ought to start. And to speak to some of your other
Yep.
questions there in that battery of questions that came. Sure. So these days I've been thinking about race in terms of domination and thinking about the paradigm of domination in terms of the enslaved trade, master and slave being the iconic figures of domination. But we also need to remember that just as that paradigm of anti-Blackness in the master and slave is concealed in today, similarly today that capitalism relies on domination is also concealed. Right? That the power that a boss has to impose his or her will arbitrarily over a worker is also a form of domination that can seem to be justified by system or rules or analysis is just justification, right? There's arbitrary power of the boss over the worker that is a question of life and death. To survive, one must participate in a system where there are bosses, right? This is domination.
Yeah.
So I think, and when we think about domination, we can't think about these systems discretely, right? That once one system of domination is over, then we'll go on to the next one, and we'll get rid of that one, and we'll go on to the next one. That one, domination inflects our social worlds, right? And it inflects all of our social worlds, how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we see the possibilities for life together. You know, that inflection is so deep that it's so deep, and each system of domination is, in fact, interconnected with another system of domination. We're constituted by systems of domination, not just one, not another, but you know, through how they're all inflecting our social worlds, ourselves. So we have to think about them as different from each other, but as not separable from each other.
Yeah, I think that's right on. I really appreciate that and the energy in which you're communicating this, because I think I feel the urgency, and I think that's particularly important to be thinking about and to be embodying as we kind of do this work, right? That it's not just stuff that happens in our heads, that it can carry us to the streets too. Part of what I think I really appreciated in your last turn here was the focus on domination. And your precision in defining domination as an individual who has a master over you with an arbitrary will. I think that's particularly important. But in one of your recent articles, you talked about how it is that domination is constituted or supported by pseudo-theological justifications. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. How is it, to put it sort of generally, how is it that religion is part of the problem, right? How is it that theology or pseudo-theology, right, begins to or constitutes death-dealing structures that are inherently dominating?
Domination by its very nature is idolatry. It's establishing one person as godlike on earth, right? It's elevating one individual, one human, into someone who has authority that only God should have. And so the critique of domination is a critique of idolatry. Right? And you know, the critique of idolatry might seem easy, right? If you can see the idols over there and then you smash them. But if domination is insidious and invidious, right? If it's inflecting our worlds, our norms, our institutions, our very selves, then that critique of idolatry involves not just smashing those idols over there, but interrogating portions of ourselves that are distorted by the forces of domination, capitalist domination, as well as anti-Black domination. And that you know, religious traditions at their best have a whole repertoire of resources and history directed at this very project, right? At worshiping a true God and challenging the false gods. religious traditions are particularly well suited for resourcing movements today that are trying to do precisely the same thing. That is, challenge those false gods of domination, which have attracted our attention knowingly or unknowingly, gods of whiteness and capitalism and patriarchy and ableism and on, and American nationalism. Turning away from those false gods, and in activist spaces and organizing spaces, there's a kind of apophaticism in the direction of what we're turning toward. But I think that there is a sense that we're turning toward a better world, that there's a world of justice that is possible, and that's why we're fighting to turn away from the world of domination in which we inhabit in the direction of this world of justice, which is possible, even if we can't fill it out, even if it's over the horizon from the present. There's a commitment to the existence of that world, whether that's called, whether there's spiritual language or theological language that's used to describe it or not. It's a sort of theological move that's happening there, the critique of idolatry and the turning away in the direction of justice.
Yeah, that was really interesting what you just said there, that there's a sort of apophaticism that's occurring within these social movements now. You've talked about this in 2 recent pieces, which we'll link here to the viewer, but you've talked about how this another world that's constituted by justice can be conjured by song and poetry and dance. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that work of conjuring. You've talked about it a little bit now, but I wonder if you can think of examples where you've seen that really well done. And I want to be mindful of that, like that sort of asking you to give examples should not suggest that that's the sort of routine work that everybody should do. Like, see this and do it again and everything will kind of follow through. But rather to keep in mind what you said, that it's suggestive, that it's conjuring things, that it's calling into something that's not yet. But also, I think it's also important, the work of reflecting on examples and the fact that they're worthy of emulation, that it's worthy for everyone else for others to pick up as well and sort of embody in their own ways. Perhaps that's sort of what I'm taking away from some of your writing on conjuring, and I'm curious to hear you reflect a little bit more practically on that, I guess.
Sure. So I'm neither a singer nor a poet nor a dancer, and I'm not very good at praying. So I'm really not the best person for giving these sorts of examples. But I mean, I do. Maybe I should point to others who are better than I am. So I think Kyle Lambelay's recent work on the School of the Americas protests, looking at the ritual action and song that brought together those protest movements in South Georgia against militarism and basically a torture training school that the U.S. Was running and sending folks to who were trained there to Central America and the Caribbean to pursue a capitalist and American agenda by means of torture to combat that kind of idolatry. This sort of ritual work was necessary, and Kyle gives very vivid and moving examples of that in his book. My colleague Andrew Prevost at Boston College has a wonderful book called Thinking Prayer, where he looks through the history of Christian thought on prayer, which is it might seem like a contradiction, thought on prayer, but trying to show how these two things are deeply interwoven, and showing that that when one looks at the German tradition, of Heidegger and the theologians responding to Heidegger, there are contradictions within that tradition, and when one looks at the German political theological tradition of Moltmann and Metz and Zola, there's promise, but there are contradictions. When one looks at the liberation theology tradition, that they're working through those contradictions and those tensions with a focus on praxis. And when one looks at Black theology, and particularly at James Cone's focus on the spirituals and the blues, one finds the best account on Andrew Prevost's reading of Thinking Prayer, right? All of the promise of Heidegger and Bultmann and Metz and Gutierrez and others is realized in James Cone's account of the Black spirituals. So that's another kind of example that I would point to, and that promise is one that merges the political and the theological, that merges organizing practice and this conversion away from idolatry in the direction of a world of justice or a God of justice. When Andrew and I were organizing a workshop a few years ago, he had this idea, which I was very skeptical of, to, on the last day of the workshop, have all these academic theologians do a ritual together. So the topic of the event was on anti-Blackness in Christian ethics. And so we collectively devised a ritual that involved memorializing Black folks who had died due to police violence and state violence, and working through naming harms and healing and imagining futures in ecumenical ritual space that was accessible to even folks who are not, are more comfortable with books than sacred objects. So it's maybe another example that I would point to.
Yeah, that's wonderful. You've given us a lot of good places to go to and to think with. So thank you. Thanks for your time. And I really just appreciate what you've given us here, and hope you continue, let's continue the work.